The candles at Harrogate had been lit at 4 o'clock, and by 9 the wax had run down the silver branches in long, pale ropes that no one had thought to trim. Beatrice Vale stood at the far end of the dining room with a folded napkin over her forearm and counted the glasses. 30 at the table, 31 on the sideboard. She had counted them twice already that evening, and both times the number had come out wrong in the same direction. And both times she had told herself that a woman in her position did not question the sideboard. The room was very warm. Lady Corvin sat at the head of it in garnet silk. Her fan held at the exact height that meant she was pleased with the seating, and beside her the new claret had been decanted into 2 vessels rather than 1, which was not the custom at Harrogate, and never had been. "The companion," someone said behind her, not quietly. "The one who reads to the aunt." Beatrice did not turn. She had learned in 11 months of service that turning was the expensive part. At the other end of the table, Gideon, the Earl of Harrogate, stood with one hand resting on the back of his chair and did not sit. He had not sat all evening. His eyes moved across the room the way a man reads a page he has already read, and when they passed over the sideboard they stopped. Only for a moment. Only long enough that Beatrice, who had spent 11 months learning to read the backs of people's heads, understood that he had counted the glasses too. What she did not yet know was that he had been counting them for 3 years. The toast was called for at 9:30. Beatrice had come to Harrogate in the second week of a wet October, with 1 trunk and a letter of character from a woman who had died before the ink was properly dry. Her father had been a physician in a market town, a careful man with a careful hand, and he had taught her to read a label before she poured from a bottle, and to write down what she had poured and when. Those were the only inheritances that had survived him. The house had gone to a cousin. The instruments had gone to the debt. The girl had gone into service, 24 years old, and educated a great deal above the wage she was offered, which was the sort of arithmetic the season found faintly amusing when it noticed it all. Her charge was Lady Augusta Corvin, the Earl's great-aunt, 81 years old, deaf in the left ear, and sharper in the right than anyone at Harrogate cared to admit. Beatrice read to her in the mornings from whatever the old woman pointed at, walked her along the south corridor in the afternoons, and sat with her in the evenings, while the house went on being a house without them. It was Lady Augusta who told her about the brother Edmund, the old woman said. On Beatrice's 4th day, apropos of nothing at all, her finger tapping the arm of her chair, he had a laugh you could hear from the stables. "Then he did not, my lady. 3 years ago. At the Michaelmas dinner, Lady Augusta's fingers stopped tapping. They said his heart. He was 31 years old and he rode to hounds twice a week and they said his heart." Beatrice, who had grown up in a house where a man wrote down what he poured, and when, said nothing at all and felt something in her chest go very still. That was the first thread. She did not pull it. A companion who pulls threads is a companion who is dismissed without a character, and a woman dismissed without a character in the winter of her 24th year has precisely 1 road left, and it is not a good one. She folded the thing away and went on reading aloud about the peninsula, and the old woman fell asleep with her mouth open, and outside the window the rain came down on the yews. The house had a rhythm, and Beatrice learned it. The Earl came down at 7. The Earl rode until 10. The Earl took his correspondence in the study with the door shut, and did not take callers, and when Lady Corvin sent for him he came, and when he came, he stood, and Beatrice had never once seen him sit in the same room as his stepmother. She noticed that before she noticed anything else about him. The season, such as it reached into Devonshire in November, had decided several things about Harrogate and its Earl. It had decided he was cold. It had decided he was in mourning, past the point where mourning was interesting. It had decided that Lady Corvin, who had married his father and buried him and stayed, was the practical mind of the household, and the Earl merely its silent tenant. And it had decided about Beatrice, in the offhand way that such verdicts are rendered, that she was the companion who read to the aunt, and that this was the whole of her. The first time he spoke to her directly was in the North Corridor on a Tuesday, and it was not a conversation. She had been carrying the old woman's shawl and a candle, and the candle had guttered at the turn where the draught came under the gallery door, and she had stopped to shield it with her hand. He came around the corner. She stepped back to let him pass. "He did not pass your hand," he said. She looked down. The wax had run, and she had not felt it, which was its own small confession about the state of her attention that week. "It is nothing, my lord." "Cold water now." His voice was level and low and carried no warmth whatsoever. "Not the kitchen. The pump in the scullery is closer." He took the candle out of her hand. He did not touch her fingers doing it. He simply removed the object from the situation and stood there holding it. A man of 34 in a dark blue coat, with his jaw set like something quarried, waiting for her to do as she had been told. She went. Her heart was going very fast in her throat, and she told herself all the way down the back stairs that it was the burn. He had not asked if it hurt. He had not offered his arm. He had issued an instruction, the way one might, to a footman who had dropped something. And she had obeyed it, and she understood perfectly well what that meant about her standing in this house. She did not understand at all what it meant, that he had been holding the candle still when she came back up an hour later, standing at the same turn in the corridor, as though he had not thought to put it down. November went on. The rain went on. She began without deciding to watch the sideboard. It was not a decision. It was the physician's daughter surfacing, in a woman who had spent 3 years drowning her. Her father had kept a book, a plain thing bound in calf, and in it he had written every draught he mixed and every grain he weighed, and he had told her once, with his spectacles pushed up into his hair, that the whole of the profession came down to knowing what was in the cup and being able to prove it afterward. At Harrogate no one wrote anything down. The claret came up from the cellar in 2 decanters. That was the first thing the custom of the house. Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, told her, had always been one. But Lady Corvin had complained of the sediment some years ago, and now there were 2, and the second one stood on the sideboard at her end and was poured by her own maid, Dorcas, and by nobody else. "Some years ago," Beatrice said. "How many?" Mrs. Pell was a woman of 60 with flour permanently in the creases of her knuckles, and no particular love for the question. 3, I should think. 4. Before Michaelmas or after? The housekeeper looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the dough and said, "You want to be careful, Miss Vale. What you count." Beatrice went up to the old woman and read aloud about the peninsula, and did not hear a word of it. The dinner in the 2nd week of December was the first proper one of the winter 18 at table, and Beatrice was there because Lady Augusta would not come down without her, and Lady Corvin would not have the aunt absent, because an absent aunt is a rumor, and a present one is merely furniture. She sat at the low end and she watched. Dorcas poured from the 2nd decanter for Lady Corvin, and for the 2 gentlemen nearest her, and for no one else. The rest of the table was served from the 1st. Beatrice, whose glass was filled from the 1st, turned the stem in her fingers and looked at the color against the candle, and thought that there was nothing here. Nothing at all. A woman prefers her own decanter. Half the great houses in England have an eccentricity like it, and the other half have 2. Then Mr. Lyle arrived. He came late, in the middle of the fish, apologizing handsomely to the room, and Beatrice watched Lady Corvin's fan come up half an inch and stay there. Ambrose Lyle was the Earl's cousin on the mother's side, 38, with a good coat and a bad tailor's account, and the particular loud ease of a man who has spent his whole life being welcome in rooms he does not own. He was seated after some rearrangement at Lady Corvin's right hand. Dorcas filled his glass from the 2nd decanter. Beatrice's hand went still on her own stem. She made herself finish the fish. She made herself answer the curate on her left, who wished to know whether Lady Augusta found the stairs difficult, and she heard her own voice say something pleasant about the south corridor, while her attention stayed fixed on a woman's wrist at the other end of the room. Dorcas poured for no one else after that. The decanter went back to the sideboard and stood there through the mutton and the syllabub and the removal of the cloth, and not one person in that room looked at it twice, because it was furniture, because a sideboard is furniture, because a companion is furniture. And Beatrice understood in that moment that the whole trick of Harrogate was that everybody in it had agreed in advance what was worth looking at. She looked up the table and found that the Earl was not looking at his cousin at all. He was looking at the decanter. And his face did nothing, absolutely nothing, and his hand on the tablecloth was perfectly flat and perfectly still. And Beatrice thought, with a coldness that started somewhere under her sternum, that he knew. He knows, and he cannot prove it. 3 years is a long time to stand at the head of a table you cannot sit down at. Later in the drawing room, Lady Corvin gathered the ladies around her, the way weather gathers, and Miss Selina Marchmont sat at her hand in ice blue silk, and played something competent, and Beatrice stood by the old woman's chair, and was not spoken to for 40 minutes, which suited her. Then Lady Corvin said to the room, but not quite, "The girl reads to Augusta." "It is a charity, really. One takes them in when there is nowhere else." Selina laughed. 2 other women did not, and looked at their hands. And that was the first small crack Beatrice noticed in the thing she had assumed was solid. Lady Augusta's hand came out sideways and closed on Beatrice's wrist. Hard. The grip of a woman who had held reins for 60 years. "She reads," the old woman said, quite loudly, into the deaf woman's silence she carried everywhere. "Better than any of you." Nobody answered. Selina's hands came down on the keys. Again, a half-beat late. If you have ever sat in a room where a verdict was delivered about you and you were required to be furniture, you know the shape of what Beatrice did next. She said nothing. She adjusted the shawl on the old woman's shoulders. She stayed exactly where the room had decided she should be, and she waited. And somewhere in that waiting, she stopped being a woman who was being careful and became a woman who was gathering. She began the book that night. It was a housekeeping ledger she took from the still room, and she wrote in it in her father's hand, the small upright hand he had taught her when she was 9 years old and could barely hold the pen. The date, the dinner, the decanters, 2, one poured by Dorcas at the north end, the names of those served from it. Mr. Lyle arriving late, seated at the Countess's right, and Dorcas filling his glass without being asked, which meant that Dorcas had been told, which meant that the arrangement had a history. She wrote down what she had poured and when, except that she had poured nothing. So she wrote down what was poured for others. She hid the ledger under the 3rd floorboard from the window in her room, and she lay awake until 3, and the rain went on. She thought about her father a great deal that night. He had been a small man with ink on his cuffs and no gift at all for being liked, and he had lost patience and written down that he had lost them, and once, when she was 14, she had watched him sit at his desk for 2 hours over a single line because a child had died, and he would not put a comfortable word in place of an accurate one. The town had thought him cold. The town had been wrong about him in exactly the way that towns are wrong, cheaply and permanently, and without ever revisiting the verdict. She had not understood it then. She understood it now in a servant's room at the top of a house in Devonshire, with a stolen ledger under the floor. What she was doing had a name in law, and the name was not a good one for a servant. She knew that. She wrote it anyway. The witnessing scene happened on the 5th of January, and she did not know she was being witnessed. The Harrogate tenants' children came up to the house on 12th night for oranges and a shilling apiece, and one of them, a boy of about 7 named Tom Fisk, came up with his ear scabbed and his shirt wrong, and would not take the orange because he could not, because his hand had been bound up in a rag and the rag was filthy and had been on for 4 days. The under-butler said, "Take it to the kitchen." The kitchen said, "Take it home." Lady Corvin, passing through the hall in her furs, did not look at it at all. Beatrice took the boy into the still room and shut the door. She unwound the rag. The hand was very bad. She did not say so. She heated water and she washed it, and she took the honey from the shelf and the clean linen from the press, and she talked to him the entire time about absolutely nothing. About the dog in the yard, about whether an orange was better than a shilling, about his sister, and when the pain made him cry, she did not tell him not to. She used the still room's brandy, which was not hers, and the linen, which was not hers, and she knew what it would cost if it were noticed. She did it slowly, and she did it right, and it took 40 minutes, And at the end of it she gave him the orange and the shilling, and her own second shilling as well, which was a quarter of what she had. Then she looked up. The Earl was standing in the doorway. She had no idea how long he had been there. She got to her feet, fast, hands wet, apron ruined, ready with the sentence she had been assembling since the moment she opened the honey. He did not let her say it. "How long has it been bound?" "4 days. My lord, whose is he?" "Fisk the East Farm." He looked at the boy's hand. He looked at the arrangement on the table, the water, the linen, the honey, the ledgering neatness of it, the fact that she had laid everything out in the order. She would need it before she began. "You have done this before," he said. "My father was a physician. Something happened in his face. It was not an expression. It was smaller than that, a kind of settling, the way ice settles over a river without appearing to move at all. Send for me if the hand is not better in 2 days," he said. "Not the steward. Me." And he was gone, and the boy ate his orange, and Beatrice stood in the wrecked still room with her heart going like a bird in a box and told herself quite firmly that he had been angry about the brandy. Her body did not believe her. Her body had known exactly where he was in the room from the moment he arrived, and had known it without looking, which was a thing she had never in her life been able to do with anyone else. Stay with me. What she found in the study 11 days later is the reason this story exists. He sent for her on the 16th of January, and it was the first time. The study at Harrogate had a fire, and 8,000 books, and a window that faced the wrong way for the light. He was standing at it when she came in, which she had by then understood was simply where he stood. "The Fisk boy has the use of his hand." "Yes, my lord. You did not send for me. It was better in 2 days. You said if it were not." He turned around. In the firelight his face was not stone at all. It was only tired, and Beatrice registered that with a lurch she did not have a name for. "Miss Vale." He said it carefully, the way a man handles something he has decided not to drop. "Why do you count the glasses?" The room went very small. She could have said she did not. She had 11 months of practice in saying she did not. She heard herself say instead, in her father's voice more than her own, "Because there are 30 at table, and 31 on the sideboard, and there have been for as long as I have been in this house, and no one has ever explained to me why the claret is decanted twice." He did not move for a long moment. Then he crossed the room, and he took a key from his waistcoat, and he unlocked the drawer of the desk, and he took out a folded paper and put it into her hands. It was a physician's note. It was 3 years old. It named a cause of death for Edmund Corvin, aged 31, and the cause of death was the heart. And at the bottom, in a different hand, cramped and small and unsigned, someone had written, "I was not permitted to open him. I record my objection." Beatrice's hands were not steady. 3 years, the Earl said. His voice had not changed at all, and that was somehow the worst of it. "I have had 2 solicitors and a man from Exeter, and a physician who would not put his name to it. There is no proof. There is a household that likes her, a table that likes her, a boy in the ground that everyone has agreed had a weak heart. She poured it in front of 40 people and not one of them saw a thing." He stopped. He had said more in that half-minute than in the 11 months before it. "He was my brother," he said. "He was drunk and loud, and he was going to marry a girl with no money. And I told him he was a fool." That was the last conversation. "Michaelmas," he laughed at me and drank his wine. The fire moved. Somewhere below, a door closed. The clock on the chimney-piece went on with its small business, and Beatrice stood holding a dead man's certificate in both hands and did not trust herself to put it down. "He was buried on a Thursday," Gideon said. "It rained." My stepmother chose the hymns, and she chose them well, and she wept at the graveside in a manner that 40 people found very affecting. And I stood beside her, and I could not make myself take her arm. He stopped. I did not know why. Not then. I only knew that my hand would not do it. Beatrice thought of a fan held at a measured height, and a decanter turned a quarter turn, and a household that liked her, and said nothing. "I have not sat at that table since," he said. "I stand, because if I sit, I am the head of the house that let it happen." Beatrice, who had been furniture for 11 months, took one step forward. "My lord," she said, "your household does not write anything down." He looked at her. "Mine does." That was the moment. Neither of them touched the other. The distance between them was 3 feet of Turkey carpet, and it might as well have been on fire. And Beatrice was aware of her own breathing in a way that was frankly humiliating, and his hand had come up halfway to her elbow, and stopped and stayed, stopped and came down again. "Show me," he said. The ledger came out from under the floorboard. They went through it at the desk with the door shut, which was a transgression that would have ended her in any house in England, and neither of them mentioned it, and Mrs. Braithwaite, Pell, who passed the door twice, mentioned it to nobody either, which told Beatrice something about Mrs. Pell that she filed away with everything else. 7 dinners. 2 decanters at all 7. Dorcas pouring the second for Lady Corvin, always, and for a rotating handful of guests, never the same twice, except that it was the same twice, because Ambrose had been served from it at 5 of the 7, and had missed the other 2 because he had been in London. "He is her creature," Gideon said. He had not called her Miss Vale in an hour. Whatever it was, he carried it, and she poured it. Or she carries it, and he pours. Beatrice turned the page. "My lord, that is not the difficulty. The difficulty is that no one will ever prove what was in a glass 3 years ago. The glass was washed the same night. Then there is nothing. There is the next one." He went very still. "The Candlemas dinner," she said. 30 at table. The second decanter will be on the sideboard because it is always on the sideboard. And Mr. Lyle has debts. My lord, Mrs. Pell says his tailor has written to the house twice. He has been useful to her for 3 years, and a useful man who becomes an expensive man becomes a man who knows too much. The thing she had been circling for 6 weeks arrived in the room and sat down between them. "You believe she means to do it again?" Gideon said to him. "I believe," Beatrice said, "that I have watched her hand at the fan for 11 months, and it went up half an inch when he came in late in December, and I have never once seen it do that for anyone she was not calculating about." He put both hands on the desk. When he spoke, his voice was low and level and completely without warmth, and by now she understood finally that this was what he sounded like when he was afraid. "If you are wrong, you are dismissed without a character, and I cannot prevent it. If you are right, you are in a room with a woman who was killed once." "Yes," Beatrice said. "Then do not be in the room, my lord." She closed the ledger. "I am the companion who reads to the aunt. I have been in that room 30 times, and no one has looked at me yet. His jaw did the thing it did. That," he said, "is the part I cannot bear." The 3 weeks between were the longest of her life. She read to the old woman every morning about the peninsula, and heard none of it. She walked the South Corridor every afternoon. She wrote in the calf-bound book every night, and twice she took it out again after she had put it away. And once she sat on the floor with her back against the bed and read her own handwriting for an hour, looking for the place where a careful woman had made a mistake and did not find it, which frightened her considerably more than finding one would have. Twice in those 3 weeks, Lady Corvin spoke to her. The first time was to ask whether Augusta's appetite had improved. The second time was in the hall, in passing, and the Countess stopped and looked at her for rather longer than the sentence required, and said, "You are very quiet, Miss Vale. It is a great virtue in a companion." Beatrice curtsied, and said that she was glad to be found, so she went up the back stairs afterward, and had to stop on the landing with one hand flat on the wall until her breathing came back. The old woman was asleep in her chair with her mouth open. The rain had turned to sleet. Beatrice stood at the window and thought, with the small dry clarity that was the only thing her father had left her that could not be sold, that a woman who compliments your silence is a woman who has begun to wonder about it. The Candlemas dinner was on the 2nd of February, and there were 30 at table. Beatrice dressed the old woman in the gray silk, and pinned her own hair, and looked at her own face in the glass for slightly longer than she had looked at it in 3 years. The gown was plain wool, the color of weak tea. She had let out the seam under the left arm. Twice. She thought, with a wry small honesty she permitted herself exactly once, that the season would find nothing in this glass to revise its opinion, and then she went downstairs to do the only thing in her life she had ever chosen, entirely on her own. The dining room at Harrogate on a February night held 200 candles, the long table dressed in white, the orchestra of forks, the terrace doors, black with cold and running with condensation, the smell of wax and hothouse narcissus and 30 people's warmth, Lady Corvin at the north end, in garnet again, Fan at the pleased heights, Selina at her hand in ice blue Ambrose 4 places down and laughing too loudly at something. His coat very fine, and, Beatrice noticed, the same coat as December. The Earl, at the south end, standing. Beatrice sat at the low end with Lady Augusta, and the old woman's hand found her wrist under the table, and did not let go. The second decanter came up at 8. Dorcas set it on the sideboard behind Lady Corvin's chair, and stood beside it, and Beatrice watched her do a thing she had watched her do at 7 previous dinners, and had never once understood until this moment. Dorcas turned the decanter a quarter turn, so that the small flaw in the glass, a bubble near the base no bigger than a pea, faced the wall, so that she would know which side to pour from. Beatrice's whole skin went cold. It was not the decanter, it was the glass. It had always been the glass, the 31st glass on the sideboard, the one that made the count wrong, the one that was carried to the table already touched. At 9:30, Lady Corvin rose and touched her fan to the cloth and said that she would ask the room to drink to her late husband's cousin's son, dear Ambrose, on the occasion of his engagement, which was news to the room, and, from the look on his face, news to Ambrose as well. Dorcas began to pour. Beatrice stood up. She was aware, with terrible clarity, of exactly how a companion looks when she stands up at a dinner she has no business at. 30 faces turned. Lady Corvin's fan stopped, and Beatrice walked the length of the sideboard with her heart slamming, and picked up 2 glasses, one from the sideboard's near end and one from its far end, and she said in a voice she was astonished to find perfectly steady, "My lady, forgive me." The Countess's glass was set down at the wrong end. I have seen Dorcas do it correctly 30 times. And she put 1 glass into Ambrose's hand and 1 glass into Lady Corvin's. She had switched them. Everyone in the room had watched her do it, and not one of them had seen a thing, because she had told them what they were watching, and they had believed her, which was, Beatrice thought distantly, the entire mechanism of the last 3 years. "To Ambrose," said Lady Corvin. 30 glasses came up. Ambrose raised his and put it to his mouth. Lady Corvin did not raise hers. The room did not notice at first. The room was drinking. It was the Earl who moved, and he did not hurry. And he crossed the length of that dining room in what could not have been more than 4 strides, and he stopped beside his stepmother's chair and looked down at the full glass in her hand. "Drink it," he said. The orchestra of forks stopped. Lady Corvin's fan was in her lap. Her hand around the stem had gone the color of the cloth. She looked at the glass. She looked at Dorcas, who had gone the color of the cloth as well and had taken 1 step backward. And that step was seen by 30 people. "Gideon," she said, "do not be absurd. I do not care for claret. You have drunk claret in this room every night for 19 years. The hour is late, and I am tired, and I will not be spoken to at my own table by a boy who has not sat at it in 3 years. Then set it down," he said, "and let Ambrose have it." And she could not. That was the whole of it. That was 3 years. She sat with a full glass in her hand in a room of 30 people, and she could not drink it, and she could not give it away. And the silence went on, and Beatrice watched the fan lie in her lap where it had fallen, and thought of a boy of 31 who had laughed and drunk his wine. Ambrose set his own glass down very slowly and looked at it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has been handed 100 times without once considering where it came from. His hand was not steady. His coat, which was very fine and 3 seasons old, had been paid for by a woman at the north end of this table, and every person in the room had watched her buy him for years, and had called it kindness. To a poor relation, aunt, he said. His voice had nothing in it at all. Aunt, what is in the wine? Lady Corvin's mouth moved. What came out was not a sentence. It was the beginning of one 3 times over. The girl has been at the sideboard. She has been at the sideboard. Ask her what she has been. Ask her. I did ask her, Gideon said. He turned to the room. Every face in it was up. Old Sir Marcus Hale, who had been at the Michaelmas dinner 3 years ago, and had signed nothing and said nothing, and had thought about it every week since, was already on his feet at the far end. And the Earl said it once, and only once, and it was 7 words. Beatrice Vale has my name and my protection. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He put out his hand, and Beatrice, at the low end of a table she had been furniture at for 11 months, walked the length of it in front of 30 people, and put her hand in his. And it was the first time he had ever touched her, and she felt it go through her like a struck bell. Sir Marcus Hale said, into the silence, Harrogate, I will send for Dr. Rowe tonight. He is 4 miles. That glass does not leave this room. Nor does the sideboard, Gideon said. Dorcas began to weep, which was the confession. Though the physician's report on the glass 11 days later was the proof, and the ledger in Beatrice's small, upright hand was the thing that told the men from Exeter where to look and what date to look at, and which glass had a bubble near its base. Lady Corvin was not dragged from the room. Nobody shouted. Sir Marcus and 2 other gentlemen walked her out through the terrace doors into the February cold, with the courtesy owed to a dowager countess, and she went between them with her back very straight, and at the door she stopped, and looked back at the table she had run for 19 years, and everyone at it was looking at her, and that was the punishment. It was sufficient. Nobody added to it. Selina Marchmont, in ice blue, was the one who picked the fan up off the floor and set it on the sideboard, and understood, in that one motion, what she had spent 4 years being told she was the correct choice for. They were married in the parish church in the 3rd week of April, with the yews still wet, and 40 people in the pews, most of whom had been at the table. Lady Augusta came, in the grey silk, and sat in the front and told 2 separate people during the vows that the girl read better than any of them. Ambrose Lyle did not come. He wrote from London a letter of 4 lines that said less than it meant. And Gideon read it once and put it in the drawer with the physician's note and locked the drawer and did not speak of it again. There was no more to be done for a man who had spent 3 years being useful and had learned at 9:30 on a February night exactly what he had been useful for. The fist boy came, with the use of his hand and the ear healed, and threw more rice than was strictly required. They did not go away afterward. There was a house to run, and 8,000 books, and a great-aunt who required reading to, and Beatrice found that she did not want to be anywhere else, which surprised her more than any other single fact of that spring. It snowed one last time in the 2nd week of May. Absurdly. A thin, wet snow that did not lie. She found him in the dining room. It was empty and unlit, and the long table was bare, and he was standing at the south end, with his hand on the back of the chair he had not sat in for 3 years and 4 months, and outside the terrace doors, the snow was coming down over the black yews and melting the moment it landed. She stopped in the doorway and watched him for a moment. The thing she felt was not pity, which he would not have survived, and not triumph, which neither of them had any use for. It was the plain recognition of a man standing exactly where he had been standing on the night she first counted the glasses, and, being at last allowed to stop, she did not say anything. She had learned, in the way that mattered, that he did not want to be asked. She pulled the chair out. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and his mouth did something she had seen exactly once before. On the night she had told him her father was a physician, and this time it very nearly arrived. "You are managing me," he said. "I am counting the chairs, my lord. There are 30. There has been one too few for 3 years." He sat down. She sat beside him in the wool gown she had never quite got round to replacing, and they did not say anything for a while. The candles were not lit. The snow went on not lying. On the sideboard, where the 31st glass had stood for 3 years, there was a plain calf-bound book, and in it, in a small upright hand, was written every draught this house poured, and the date it was poured on, and the name of the person who poured it, and it would be written in every day of Beatrice's life at Harrowgate. And it was the only ornament she ever asked for. It was not an ornament at all, of course. And she knew it, and she let the house go on calling it one. Her father would have known exactly what it was. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Beatrice's stillness at that table stayed with you, sit a moment with it before you go.